Hi, everybody. We're just going to get started in a minute or two. Hopefully your guys' day went well. If you want to use a chat, please do. You can unmute as well. I like to start off usually with a kind of just an icebreaker or a question. If you're driving, you don't have, please don't, please don't use the chat. But how was your day? I like to say, you can put it in a word or emoji. How was your day today? Today's Tuesday. Hopefully we're done with school for the day. And is there an emoji that you could use for how today went, or a phrase or a word? That would be nice to just kind of get us going, because it is a couple minutes after the hour, but we're waiting for people to log in. So I'm looking at my chat to see what my day was like today. I think I had this kind of a day to go with. The stars. I had a good day. That would be my emoji to kind of talk about my day today. You can also tell me where you're from, what school you're at, anything like that. Nikki had a day that she's wearing her glasses, so she must have read a lot today. That kind of a day too, especially when we're on our computers. Yes.
Emoji was called nerd, and I feel like I had a good nerdy day
That's good.
of reading for some content we're creating.
I like it. Hopefully you guys had some good days today too, or you're still going with your day, because we're not done yet. Lori said smile face, so that's a good thing. It means your day was pretty good. You're not crying, so that's good. Your emoji. Please feel free as we talk as much as possible through the chat. We really like participation, whichever way you want to do that. So if you are just here to listen, that is great. If you are here to give your opinion or any example, great. Unmute yourself. We are happy with that. Just put your little hand up or interrupt us. It's a small group today. So really, if you have any questions or anything, use that chat, then we can talk about that. We can talk it through. I like using the chat because you can talk to each other. So that is kind of a sense of community. So please use that as much as you would like. Or if you just want to sit back and listen to it, that's fine too. We like to just say that giving choice is helpful for all people. So thank you for that. Nikki, you think we should get started?
Yep, that sounds great. Thank you all for being here today. We're excited to see you.
Yes. So today we're talking about supporting multilingual learners with disabilities, identification, and instruction. I am Alana, and this is Nikki. My lens is special education. I was a special education teacher for 18 years in the classroom. So that is where my lens is from. And Nikki is the general education teacher. So it's nice to work together, because we have, we had students with special education services in our classes, and we can kind of come back from both views for you. So our learning objectives today is we're going to understand the intersection of language development and disability. So what does that mean? Students have EL services and they might have a disability, right? Because those could be two different things, or they could have both of those things. We're going to apply best practices for evaluating multilingual learners for special education services. We're going to go through that and thinking about your team at your school. What are your practices and how does it align with what we're talking about today? And maybe you can take that back to your school and discuss that further, have a deeper dive with your team. We're going to implement strategies for differentiating instruction to support multilingual learners. So we're going to talk about some strategies. Nikki's going to do that later on. How do we differentiate instruction and to support multilingual learners in that good tier 1 instruction? That solid, that general education curriculum. How can we do that for those students? And then we're going to collaborate with teams of professionals to coordinate, align student support. As a special education teacher, sometimes I felt a little siloed in my district with the general education teacher sometimes, and we really have to work together because that is what's best for students. And also working with the EL teacher, that is helpful too. I've worked with some districts that are really working on that. What are the best practices for how do we refer students when they come into our school for special education and EL services? And it's really sometimes, it could be separate, but it also could be working together as a team. And that is really important. We're going to talk about how we do that and thinking about that at your school. What are your practices and how could we maybe make that better? So those are our 4 learning objectives that we're going to go over today. And again, if you need to use the chat or to talk to me, that would be great. Or if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to. We have a small group today, so you can unmute and kind of talk with us. But the first part we're going to talk about is evaluation and identification. I'm going to move my view real quick. All right, so identification, we're going to talk about MLLs, or multilingual learners. They're disproportionately represented in special education. Disproportioned meaning that sometimes they're over and underrepresented, because sometimes students come into school and you're not sure if it's because they don't know the language. And so teachers are saying they need to be referred, they're behind the other students. And it's really because they haven't learned the language yet. So they're referring them to special education services. And maybe, and the other end of it, this is why it's a little confusing, is they're underrepresented because sometimes the students do know the language, or even if they acquire the second language, they're having special education, they will still have special education in that second language. So they have both over and underrepresented in those populations. Some teams are over referring and some are under referring. So if they had dyslexia in their native language, they would still have that even when they learn the new language. So those are kind of the things that we're going to talk about today. Practitioners must understand a student's language proficiency prior to evaluation for special education. So we need to use that data, and we need to say which level are these students at before we have that data for the special education. And we also, how many of you guys do MTSS? Use that chat and do a thumbs up or thumbs down. How many of you guys have those supports and interventions in place? We know students need MTSS supports before, during, and after special education evaluation. So you guys can use the chat throughout, but hopefully you have this. So MTSS, great. So MTSS should focus on students' skills. And if students need certain skills, they, just because they have English language, and they're at risk for English language, they should still have those interventions in place before referring them. So making sure they go into those system of supports, and then we're going to make those data-based analysis of the impact of instructional supports. So are those instructions and supports working or not? How do we know and how don't we know? So some of you guys, maybe you have data team meetings or PLCs. So you're going to look at those instructions, and if maybe 5 students are going out for those supports, you're going to look at that data and you're going to say, is this intervention working? How do we know and how do we not know? So the students that you think are at risk, they should still be using those multi-tiered system of supports before you refer them to special education. During, so say that you're like, okay, our team's going to refer them for special education, then you refer them. They're still going to use those interventions. We're still going to use that data. They might receive tier 2 supports, and then you're going to say, look at the data, and you're going to say, is it working? And if it's not, maybe they're going to need more support. So they're going to maybe use 45 minutes of those supports. We're going to focus on one skill. So if they need some support, then they need decoding. That will be what the group is working on for this. And then we're going to figure out what the impact of those instructional supports are. So as the students, as before you refer them, during referral, and even when they get special education services, those students should be able to get those MTSS supports. Just because they qualify for something, it really, in a true MTSS support, we're trying to use those interventions to move those students up to grade level. So that would be really how you would use MTSS. And I know in a district that I worked in, we didn't always do that as well as we probably could have. Sometimes we would have students in interventions, and then once they qualified for special education, they would not be in those intervention groups, but we know that they need more support in that. So really, they doesn't, regardless of label, they should still get those supports in your school. So just thinking about that. And thank you for that thumbs up. I'm glad for that MTSS, that you use that support. If you don't, that could be something that you think about and talk about what's our protocol for that. Thanks, Nick. Can we go to the next slide? So assessments, screeners are helpful and appropriate, but remember that solid instruction is key with deciding if a student has a disability versus limited English proficiency. So if a student fails a screener first and they haven't had a chance to get that best first instruction, that's not always a red flag. Assessment data is great to have, but we have to look at the whole picture. So we need to make sure that we think about students. Are they not getting the material because they don't know our language, or are they not getting the material because they don't know our language and there's something else going on, right? And they might have a disability. So we have to have those conversations because we don't know which is impacting it, or is it both? So those assessments are really helpful. Those screeners are really helpful that you use in your school, but having those team talks is really important for that. We must remember that young students, I taught K-1-2 for a couple of years, and I saw this a lot. Students would come in maybe in kindergarten and first grade, but they haven't had that solid instruction yet. So they came in, they're new to school, they they speak another language at home, so they're trying to get the language, but they also haven't had the solid tier 1 instruction. They haven't had the scaffolds or supports. They haven't been in any intervention time. And teachers would say, I think something's going on with these students. And you'd have to say, let's remember that they're young. We have to give them time to get those solid, to learn the new material and the new language before thinking about referring them to special education. I actually work with a district that says we are not going to make any referrals for students for special education if they speak a different language until for a year if they're really young. So say if they're going through kindergarten, like we're going to do all the interventions, we're going to do all these things for the student before we think about it for a little while, because you can't just have these kids come in kindergarten and not give them time to figure out their new language, because that is really hard. And so that's just their protocol. So I'm thinking about you and your school. Do you have any protocols like that when you have young kids? And if you don't, you can go back to your team and say, what do we do when students are young and they haven't done school yet? What is our protocol for this? Because that is just a thing to think about with those assessments. Thanks, Nick. And best practices for evaluation. So this is the Indiana Department of Education 2024. It's linked down here on the right. So you can, I think, Niki, are you going to put it in the chat?
Yes.
I'm going to put it in the chat so you guys can look at it. It's a really nice graphic that we're going to kind of go through. So if you could earmark this, it's just a good place that you would know for a resource. But this is the steps that you want to take when you're thinking about evaluation of a student. So what we have to have in place before we think about our evaluation. You're going to first collect data to determine if the assessments in English will provide accurate results. That's first thing. You're going to use the home language survey, the WIDA access, or the alternate access results. I taught students with more severe cognitive disabilities, so I'm very familiar with the alternate access, WIDA alternate access. And incorporate all ILP supports into assessments and instruction as appropriate. So we're going to make sure if students have those ILP supports, that they have to have those in their instruction as they need. We're going to use the accommodations as appropriate and do not invalidate test results. That means that if you are giving a student a screener or an assessment that says it's a comprehension, you can't, as a teacher, we can't read it to them, even though they have that accommodation on their ILP, because that will invalidate their results, right? That's why it's very scripted. When you give those standardized assessments, it'll tell you when you could read things or when you can't read things, or you can give the accommodations. So we have to make sure that we give that to the students so we get the baseline data. We need to include appropriate English language staff, the EL staff. So like I said, sometimes things are siloed in your building, so you need to make sure that those EL staff, special education, gen ed, all the people are at the table. The psych, the diagnostician, all of those people are at the table throughout the process, especially in the case conferences, because everybody has something to say and they have some data. We also need to support parents throughout the process. That's the best practice. We used to have a liaison. My school that I taught at, we were more, Spanish was basically the most spoken at my school. So we had a parent liaison. So it was a paid position actually they got, and they supported the parents because the parents said that they didn't. And one of our surveys said they didn't feel that welcomed because they were scared to talk to maybe the teachers or the principals because they didn't know their language. So we had a liaison to help those parents through it. And it really helped us with not just the survey, but feeling that those parents were welcomed in our school, and we wanted them there to support the student. So making sure that you have those the translation services in place. It might be easier in our school because we did have Spanish. I know it's a little harder on your schools. And if you want to throw that in the chat, what kind of languages do you support? Might be something interesting for me to know. That would be helpful. But making sure everything's printed in both languages and as much as you can. So these are just the best practices when you click on there. Niki gave you that link. And does anybody have any questions or anything about that graphic? I like how it talks about it in both of them. Is it on the next slide, Niki? Did you have it out? Yeah. All right. So this is what you guys should, if you clicked on this, this is what you would see. And in the chat, if you have any other, besides Spanish, just curious what other students that you support. But on the left, the special education and English learner identification and evaluation process. So like I said, some districts, it's very siloed, meaning that the EL, the special education teams are not, they don't come together a lot. And I think it is important for them to know what the system is. So if we get a student in our school, what happens when we suspect that they have a disability? What happens when we suspect that they have both needs? They have an ILP need and they have an IEP need. So what's going on? So on the left is the process for a special education request. So if the school receives a special education request, that could be verbal or in writing, and they can talk to, like, say a parent calls and they call the teacher or they call the principal, then that's a request for a special education. We're receiving it. The school's receiving it. What happens next? The school has to provide a written notice to evaluate or not. Just because the parent asks for it doesn't mean you have to do it, but it has to be based on data. You have to have a reason why, and you have to have it in written form back to that parent in 10 instructional days. So that is the process of what we have to happen. So for example, if there's a student that comes in kindergarten and the parent is really worried that he's behind and maybe it's only halfway through kindergarten, and the parent calls the teacher and says, I want my student evaluated for special education. She goes back to the team and the team has to say, we have to look at the data, and there's not a lot of data because it's kindergarten. They weren't in preschool. Maybe they're a new student, and there's English needs as well. So the school does not have to provide an evaluation, but they do have to provide a written reason why they did not. Maybe they didn't have there's lack of data. So that would be the second part of this process. Or they say, yes, we are gonna go on with the evaluation. If the team says, okay, we're gonna go on with the evaluation, we have enough data to support this, then you have to obtain the parent consent. Then the school will write down the date that the parent signed. That's in the IEP system. Then you're going to collect additional information and complete evaluations depending on what category that the parent that we suspect the disability. You're going to provide the parent a copy of the full evaluation, and you're going to have a case conference meeting to determine eligibility, and you're going to develop the IEP within 50 instructional days of when the parent signed and wrote the date on the paper. And return it back to the school. So that whatever the date is that the parent signed is when it starts, that timeline. Now the middle is the home language survey. So if the parent fills out the home language survey and it indicates that another language other than English is spoken, then there's going to be administer the WIDA screener. After that, there's the proficiency score that you're going to get. So if it's less than 4.9, like it says in this great flow chart, the student enters into the ELD services. So they're going to receive some services and they're going to have an ILP. They're going to receive that and they're going to get their accommodations that they need. If they proficiency score is above the 5.0, they do not need the ELD services, and they're going to be enrolled in general education classes. These processes can go together. They can be at the same time. So one should not be hindering the other one. And it says this right over here, so you can read this yourselves. But I just want to point out that states and local education agencies have an obligation to ensure that evaluations of children suspected of having a disability are not delayed or denied because of qualifying for English learner status. So that's why I say these shouldn't be in silo. Everybody should be talking together, because if you suspect a student that has a disability and he also has an ILP, that's what we're why we wanted to point that out today. And this is the link that Niki shared, and I really like this because it kind of puts it out there in every step. And then you could think about what happens when a student comes to your school. Is this the way that we follow it? Is this what happens? Does our team talk together? Because this is really how we should how the best practices of how that we should do that. And this is right on our the Department of Education's website. Nikki, do you have anything to add? I talked a lot. Does anybody have any questions in the chat, or does this make sense? And you probably maybe have seen this before, but if not, I just think this is a great graphic so you can have that visual.
I think this alleviates a lot of confusion. Just to kind of add on to what you said, sometimes districts aren't sure, well, if they're being tested for special education, do we do all of the other things? Yes, these two things can be happening at the same time, and one should not impede the other. So that's really important to note for all districts for best practices.
Thanks. Sometimes I'm talking a lot and I need to pause and have you guys talk back to me, or have you guys talk in the chat. If you're just listening, that's fabulous too. So referral decisions and eligibility, we're going to determine if the need originates from the lack of English language proficiency and or students' disability related educational needs. So is it because when the student catches up in English, are they going to be able to catch up with the other students, or is there something else going on? Would they have dyslexia? Would they have any of those other learning disability in their native language? We have to determine which is what impacts. So, and there's a couple ways that we can do that, but we have to make the decision by the team, and the team includes English language development, the ELD, the data, and the knowledgeable EL staff, because we have to look at all of the data that we talked about, the assessments, the observations in class, all of those, any of those, the WIDA information, and the EL staff, because they can make their recommendations. They've been in your building. They know they can help you with that. The referral decision should be supported by documentation. So really, it's the lack of progress in core instruction. That's the biggest thing. If the students are not making any progress in the core instruction, then that's kind of like a little red flag. Okay. It's not just because they don't know the language. I think it's because something else is going on. Difficulties persist after supplemental intervention. So as I asked you guys, if you had the MTSS, you have these students going out into these skill groups. Maybe you have 5 students and 4 of them are making progress, but 1 student is still not making progress. That's when there could be another little flag, like, okay, these students are making little progress, even though that English isn't their first language, but this other student is not. Is there something more? That could be a conversation that you would have. The student's behavior or academic performance differs from peers who are making expected progress in tiered instruction and intervention, which I just kind of explained. You're giving them tier two instruction. That means that maybe they're getting 30 minutes in decoding, and they're still not able to do that. So then you're going to bump it up to 45 minutes. Maybe that's your tier 3 intervention, and you're also doing all these other things, and they're still not making progress. That could be some data to support that there might be something else going on, and maybe we should refer for a disability, because it's a little bit more than that they're not getting the language. It might be something else, like a learning disability. So that is some ideas to think about with your team. All right, and Nikki's going to take over and talk about what can we do to help instruction and supports in the classroom.
Thank you. I want to take just kind of a minute for a breather to pause to see if there's any questions, anything you'd like to follow up on. Are there any major roadblocks that you are seeing in your practice within your buildings or your districts that you're thinking, I really wish Niki and Alana would have addressed this? So if any of those things come up when it comes to referral decisions, eligibility, assessment, any of that, as it kind of comes up here in just a moment, please feel free to throw that in the chat, to unmute and let us know other questions that you might have in that area for us to better support you.
Yep, and I'll manage a chat and make sure, and then I'll let you know, Nick.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we can keep going, but please don't be shy about it. We always preach wait time in our other sessions, but sometimes it's so hard in Zoom to know whether you all are at home rolling your eyes, or if you would like us to keep going, or if you have questions. So please don't be shy about letting us know if you have those, and know that we should give you lots more wait time than this, but we're going to keep going. All right, so when we look at different instructions and supports that we need to put in place for our students who are multilingual, we really have to look at what best practices is for oral language fluency. More than anything else, it's important to note that oral language fluency is actually the most impactful long-term literacy success for MLLs. It's the factor that really determines if our MLL students, our multilingual learners, are going to be able to jump into the world of literacy and speech in their new language. So that's really important to start from the very beginning, focusing on that oral language fluency, excuse me. Oral language fluency is going to be how well our students are speaking and reading with accuracy, speed, and expression. So making sure that they know they're using the appropriate words, that they're speaking at an appropriate tone and level, and also that they're using expression that helps to show that they understand punctuation, understand even things like sarcasm and idioms and phrases and things throughout those speech patterns. That's a lot. It's a lot for students in their first language, let alone in the second language. So one of the most basic tier 1 things that we can put in for our students is to make sure we are attending to their oral language needs in every aspect of their classroom. Supports that we can build into their classroom activities are simple things that many of us who are elementary teachers, we do these things sort of naturally. Don't be afraid to pull these into middle school and high school as well, so that you can really fully support those students. So if some of these sound too little for your students, we'll talk about ways that we can improve, that we can adapt those into that high school level for our English language learners who might be attempting to gain a new language a little later on. Some of these include having small group and partner discussions. Don't ever underestimate the power of letting students practice these new words and these new ideas in context with a friendly peer, and even with others who speak their same second languages or same home language as well. Because building on those conversations, building on those practices are going to give them the additional opportunities they need to start having some ownership and generalization of the new language. Another great helpful piece is anchor charts. I can tell you one of the things that my husband is an English language learner, and one of the things he always said was that when he was younger, anything that was on the wall was just really good for him. He remembers there was a poster of an idiom, of idioms in his 3rd grade classroom that really was something that helped him understand some of the sayings and things that his friends were using. So I know that's not pulled from research, but it's definitely something that we can be aware of with our students. Anchor charts are so impactful because it supports what we're saying out loud and also gives them that literacy support as well. Our anchor charts also give our students something to refer to consistently. Much like sentence frames and sentence stems, if we're giving students that support, they're going to be more likely to own and then generalize that information to new settings. So some things to know is that sentence frames and sentence stems, those give our students the ability to know where to start with a sentence. So we want to be able to say to them, I like going to the park because, and let them fill in the end of it. But we gave them the sentence frame, which allows them to understand the grammatical structure of each of those opportunities. We also make sure that as teachers, we're using these words in context. So we're regularly presenting this kind of information and using it in context. So if we know that our English language learners are struggling with, say, newer vocabulary in different settings, when we're out on the playground, when we're anywhere, we can start using those vocabulary words, simple things like identifying pen and pencil and marker, and those words that are related to each other but have those subtle differences. Same thing with going, say, out to the park or playground. Then we can start talking about, different things like the tube and the slide, right? That sometimes students use those words interchangeably, but it might create confusion for our students. So making sure that as the teacher, you're using those words and I'm slowing down to identify them. So, it's the slide, but if it's enclosed, it's a tube slide. So sometimes students call it just the tube. And those kinds of language supports that are built into our conversation with students can be supported throughout as well. I'm going to go on here, but I do encourage you to take a moment to process that and then think about what do you do naturally as you work with students that support your students in that way. Because one of the big strategies that can be used is called the 5-turn conversational framework. This generally, when I work with teachers, they say that this framework shouldn't be this big aha moment, but it is, because we have conversations with all of our students day in and day out. But when we strive for 5 is what the framework is called, it means that we try to have 5 pieces of the conversation. So research shows that most conversations with our students are generally 3 turns. So if I say, "Good morning, how is your day?" the student will say, "Oh, my day is fine." And I'll say, "Great to hear." And so we go back and forth. It's usually a 3-turn conversation. However, by taking it one step further, we're able to deepen the knowledge and understanding that our students have of the language that we're teaching them. It also allows them to expand their vocabulary and to hear you as the teacher use vocabulary in context. So it could be something as simple as, "Good morning, how was your evening last night?" And the student says, "Fine, went to the park." And then we say, "Well, at the park, I love to go on the swings. What do you love about the park?" And that next piece comes in. So by going back and forth and having a minimum of 5 turns in a conversation, we're able to add exposure to new vocabulary in context, which is going to strengthen the language acquisition skills of our students. We can also use with the Strive for 5, we can also use sentence stems to encourage complete thoughts. This means that once you have that relationship with your students and there's that comfort level, don't be afraid to show them, "I want your responses to occur in this grammatically correct way." Again, we don't want that negative feedback, but we want to offer opportunities to kind of keep them going, but also keep them going in a way that matches the syntax of our language. An example of that would be, I was recently in a classroom where the teacher greeted every student at the door every morning. So common practice for us, right? But she greeted every student in the morning. But what she would have them do, she would always have a question of the day that she was going for. And so the day I was there, the question was about animals. And so she had some sentence stems that were in this little canister. So if it was a student was struggling to respond in the moment, and this was for her language learners as well as just all of her students, it benefited everyone. While they're standing there at the doorway talking to her, maybe they couldn't think of something that they loved about the animal or about the animal's environment or all of these different things. So she had this little can and it just had some sentence stems in it. And if they were struggling to think of something, they were able to pull one out of this little can and then start reading it. And every student I watched who was struggling initially, they pulled that sentence stem. And once they got started with it, they were able to complete the full 5-turn conversation, which was really impactful for all students. And also it really gave that teacher an opportunity to keep practicing how she could expand on that vocabulary with her students, which it was just really neat to see. So I encourage you to think about how you can use this 5-turn conversation framework with your students, whether it's an informal conversation at the door or a more formal academic conversation, which is actually what we're going to watch next. We're going to watch a quick video. It's about 2 minutes long. And in this video, I want you really to look for, how does this teacher support and expand vocabulary in every turn? I do know that this one obviously has some script to it. You'll see it's definitely well prepared, but ask yourself what this could look like in your own small group of working with your students.
So we just read this book and we learned about how a plant grows and what germination is. So we learned that germination is when a seed starts to grow. Who can remember what part of the plant grows down? Can you remember what grows down?
Roots.
What do roots do?
They make it stand up and it gets food, water, and
Good.
minerals.
Where do roots grow?
And down in the soil.
Down in the soil. Can you say that whole sentence? Roots grow down in the soil.
Roots go down in the soil.
Good job. Roots grow down in the soil. Now touch your ear if you can remember why roots grow down in the soil. Can you remember why roots grow down?
To get food, water, and to stand up.
Okay, can you say that in a whole sentence? Roots grow down.
To get food and water, to stand up.
Good. So roots grow down into the soil to get water and minerals from the soil as well as oxygen, right? To help our plant grow. Okay, very nice job.
I'm going to go back here for just a minute to this previous slide and just ask the look for question again. When you watch this video, how did the teacher support and expand vocabulary in each turn? What did you notice? Oh, they're so quiet. I might just have to do it.
There is also a question in here, but after this one.
Yeah.
So let me see. Good.
I think
Modeling the sentence for the student to repeat. Yes, Laura. Perfect. Modeling the sentence for the student to repeat. Yep. She showed a good model.
and I loved it. She used the students' wording to start off the sentence so that the student was able to see how validate their own wording and their own language in that sentence, but really get the student to put it into that complete sentence. Great. Thank you. Sorry, Alana. Now I see the chat. I didn't for a minute.
No, that's okay.
So also within this, a couple of things to note. You'll notice that the teacher in this case used consistent vocabulary. She provided vocabulary support as she was teaching, where she gave some synonyms throughout or some examples, but really she was using the vocabulary from the text without having to water down that vocabulary. She used it consistently, and she kept that vocabulary at grade level even for students who were struggling with the language piece to make sure they had continued exposure to the new language. So should we stop here? Now I see the question.
Yeah. Sorry, and that was after mine, but she was like, she directly sent it to me and then she meant to send it to the whole group. So I didn't want to stop anything. But she asked the whole group after that, Brianne.
So Brianne mentioned that she has a student who she believes has a speech impairment. How would we do an evaluation on them? Would it be in their native language? So there's a couple of practices for that. One of the pieces of advice that the research says, and that our team member who is the school psych also said that what we want to do is we want to make sure we check with the parents on this. So it's important to really have that conversation with the parents first to find out if that same issue is happening in the student's home language, because that would be an excellent piece of data, even as it is informal, to understand that the same issue is happening in the home language and the new language, and then that would be able to help determine your next steps there. So if it is happening in both languages, then you would go ahead and move forward with an evaluation. Depending on, I see your second question there, would it be in their native language? In most cases, it would actually be in the home language because those are the sounds that we want to build long term. But I think honestly that could be because those aren't necessarily, it's not considered that valid and reliable test that has to be given in the same framework all the time. I guess, Alana, do you have extra thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, I said, as long as a standardized test is available in their native language and it's able to, you can't, you can't translate it to a different language because that would be invalid results, like we said, like, I think Nikki, is that what you mean? But this, yeah, so I would definitely talk to the school site because they know the rules about that, or that the person that does that testing, because if it is in the native language and you're able to give it in the native language, my school system had, a person that spoke Spanish, and she was also a psych. So she used her native language of Spanish to give students if they needed it, like Nikki said, if it was spoken at home and if other things happened, and if there was a valid and reliable test to do that. So it really depends on the situation, I think. Nikki, do you agree? And we can of course get more, but it's very specific to students and to what the need is. I'm thinking. Do you agree, Nikki, or?
I do, and I think part of it too is that in the area where Alana and I live, we see the majority would be Spanish speaking students, and so many of the phonemes are similar between English and Spanish that is kind of a go-to. But I know that many of you in districts across the state you have so many other languages that are present, and if those shared phonemes, it would make no sense to test a student in a different language that maybe didn't have some of those R sounds or the S sounds. So you'd want to really base it on what your ultimate goal is for that student and their native language to determine whether there's enough overlap there to determine if it's happening in both languages. Did that sort of answer your question, Brianne? I'm sorry.
And Maggie, if you want to talk to, we can, anybody who wants to unmute, they can clarify.
Speech is definitely a tough one because you really have to know the nuances of the home language as well to make sure that that student has that opportunity to build those muscles, to understand how to move their tongue and mouth to make certain sounds. That's where that piece would come in. So I would really work closely, again, making sure you're not siloed with your SLP department to make sure that you can ask those questions and understand the differences and similarities between the two languages and where those difficulties might lie.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer.
And Alana and Nikki, I would add anything, but you guys are really like kind of speaking to the points that I would add. So, kind of considering those things, talking to your school psych, also, talking to the parents and those screeners about what they're seeing with maybe some of their same language peers, and that can be kind of helpful in the observations. But as far as testing goes with those materials, I think you guys hit a lot of those points.
Thank you, Maggie.
So continuing with the thoughts of how we identify, so the Strive for 5 framework is helping our students to grow that oral language fluency that goes into vocabulary. But we also know that what our ELL student or our MLL students need is they really need to understand vocabulary in context, in speech, and then also in the academic context piece. So we have to really focus on our vocabulary instruction. And we do that in a number of different ways. But research tells us that we really have to look at our instructional design very carefully, and that the words that we choose to teach and the words that we choose to identify out loud and in writing and really give our students lots of exposure to, we have to really be picky about how we choose those and what our purpose for using each of those words is. One great resource for this is the Indiana Academic Standards Framework, that IAS framework document. It has vocabulary lists that could support this work. So as we get into the nitty-gritty of choosing and the different tiers of vocabulary, if you're thinking, wow, I wish there was just a resource that told me what the best words were to teach at, say, the 3rd grade level, go into that framework and look to see the list that's there. And then really take a look at your curriculum, your practices as a teacher, and ask yourself, are these the words that I'm really spending the time on and using in all of these different contexts? What we have to think about for our students is we have to think about how we use the word. So anything that we consider when we're looking at how we choose the instructional design of how we're going to teach vocabulary, and also which words to teach. The first thing is always to look at the 3 tiers of vocabulary. We know that anything that we call a tier 1 word These are words that are commonly used in speech or in text. These are words that our students who are natural English speakers have had exposure to likely throughout their lives. So these would be things like the word phone, right? Those are words that we see all the time. Our students see, they hear words like computer, sun, sunshine, sunlight, coffee. All of those words are very common that we see and hear in our student speech. That means we know our multilingual learners, they need to be able to be exposed to those. These are words that we might not teach intentionally to all of our students, but we do know that these are words that our MLL students might need as with some extra support with. Tier 2 words are words that are high frequency in text. These are words that could be multiple meaning. So we might not think too much about it, but a great example that always comes up is the word run. Your first go-to for the word run might be like actually running, the physical action of it. I'm going to go with, that's the one I like to think about the least for a million reasons. But instead of maybe thinking about the physical act of running, maybe you're thinking about your mascara running down your face or a run in a fabric, those kinds of things. So we have all of these different options for the word run. Tier 2 words are words that we see often, but if they're used a little bit differently, we have to make sure that we address that with our students. So it could be a very high frequency word that we just think of as tier 1, but if it can change meaning regularly, depending on the context, we have to consider that a tier 2 word and look at how we're instructing with that as well. Another aspect of tier 2 vocabulary, these are words that come across in lots of aspects of text. So you'll see there on the screen words like adjust, analyze, determine, understand. All of these words are words that come up whether you're looking at reading or writing or math or social studies. We see these words across contexts and across different aspects of understanding, and we have to be able to have our students know how to understand them and use them to follow those kinds of directions. Finally, tier 3 words are subject-specific words. From the video we just saw, the word germination, germination, roots, those are those subject-specific words. Sometimes they go across other subjects as well, right? Sometimes we get to a word like addition, and we know that's a math-specific word, but we also know that it could apply in other contexts as well. So we also talk about making additions in words when we talk about adding prefixes or suffixes to words. We say putting an addition on there. And so those words, we know that we can use, they're subject specific, but we also have to address if they work in other contexts as well. The tiered vocabulary system helps us to, as the teacher, we have this metacognitive approach to it. These are some words that are coming up in this reading or in this video our students are about to watch or in the conversation we're about to have. And we have to identify which of these words we can support with just a few words that we're sharing. So if you think maybe your student has, many students would know the word phone, but in the text it actually says telephone, we can say that out loud pretty quickly to our students. We can embed that into what we say out loud in our directions. And then that's going to help our students to be more prepared to see that in a text. Where there are other ones, those tier 3 words, that we really need to be explicit about teaching, because we know that those are the words that are going to help our students be successful with that particular text. Again, as instructors, we cannot teach each and every word that our students are going to see in a text or in a speech or in a video, but what we know is that if we are intentional in the way that we scaffold and support them, it's going to help them be successful long-term with those vocabulary words. So just being intentional ourselves and understanding the different nuances of these words definitely can support our students that way. One thing I want to make sure that you hear is that this doesn't mean that every text or everything that you ever do, there should always be a list of, these are my tier 1, my tier 2, my tier 3. We're trying to avoid teacher burnout, right? Not encourage it. So keep in mind that these are things just to be aware of, because it changes the way that you speak and the way that you address your students if you kind of have in the back of your mind. So that little bit of prep goes a long way. Doesn't have to be those fancy lists. It doesn't have to be on a perfectly decorated paper that tells all of the vocabulary that goes with this text. it does have to be something that you're intentional about as an instructor. So keep that in mind and encourage your staff that you share this with to do the same as well. Just being intentional in how we choose words and how we speak to our students is going to have a big effect on their oral language fluency as well. What we know about vocabulary is that the ultimate goal is to know a word. Knowing a word does not mean memorizing the spelling or memorizing a definition. So we have to kind of set aside that way of thinking that if they can match the word to the definition, then it's probably going well for them. What we know with our students, especially our multilingual learners, we know that knowing a word means that they have to know the meaning when they're reading, and they have to know the meaning when they're reading in a variety of different contexts. We also know that they can pronounce the word, they can spell the word. One of the speeches I went to by Emily Hamford, she said her own son used the word epitome, but he was speaking it in speech to her. He had only seen it reading, and he said, well, I kept hearing it, and he kept saying epitome. And she said, and I couldn't figure out what he was getting at. And I finally realized, because we were talking about something that they had seen in a video, and she said, I realized he was saying the epitome. And he had seen that word in writing so many times, but no one had ever said it out loud in his presence. He never made the connection between what he saw in reading and what he heard in the world and in this video they were watching. Our students, we have to make that full connection for them. We have to make sure they have access. They can pronounce the word, they can spell the word, they know the meaning, they can recognize the characteristics of the word, so they would know multiple meanings of the words. And also they can explain those meanings in context, and they can use it in part of their natural language. So that generalization piece where a student owns the word and they can come up with it themselves and they can use it themselves in context is so key. There are some really great supports that we can put in place for our multilingual students in order to help them achieve this goal of knowing a word. A really great example of this is to really look at the way we support vocabulary for all students. So having opportunities to participate with great graphic organizers such as the Freyer model and other visual models of visualizing a vocabulary word is really key. And also making sure that we give these students the opportunities to make meaningful connections between their home language and the new language. So some opportunities for that could be letting them explore a little bit, opening up the opportunity to say have two words that are available to the student. This is the English version, and then say this is the Spanish version or whatever version is their home language. And then from there, asking them to identify similarities and differences, much like that Freyer model does. How does it connect to things we know and things we don't know? What are the similarities and differences? Do I hear any of the same sounds in English and Spanish or English and in a different language? Can they make those connections on their own? Because what we know is that making connections there is going to be beneficial for all of our learners as well. All right. And so through that, with our vocabulary instruction, these are just some best practices from the research to be aware of when you're providing that intense vocabulary instruction for all students, but especially those multilingual learners. One thing I want to point out is that multisensory support is so key. That comes up over and over again in that those instructional design principles in the research, making sure we give our students the opportunities to have movements, to use pictures and visuals, graphic organizers to sort and connect words. Anytime you're, say, learning a new sound maybe or a new piece of information, you can create those different word sorts and things that allow your students to kind of work with it to see how it feels. In those younger grades, a lot of times we'll see through programs like UFly or Heggerty, where teachers are very explicit in showing students, this is how my mouth moves when I make the sound. It sounds like this, it's just like the beginning of this word. You can do that with your multilingual learners as well. A great opportunity is to say things like, it's okay to say, well, I'm using the word reconnected. And what kinds of sounds do you hear that maybe you hear in other words? And bring students to the understanding that they hear the word or they hear the prefix re and they hear suffix ed on the end of that. And so you making those connections through can help them see that as well and see the nuances of language in the English language. Embedding lots of vocabulary instruction into conversation. So one of the big instructional design principles of in the research available is that adult and child interaction around new vocabulary is one of those top practices that show the most promise. So the more opportunities like that Strive for 5 conversation framework that we can give our students to interact with adults in conversation is going to be really key to their long-term success in that oral language and speech. Finally, one of the big things is by connecting to words that they already know. So we know this from just basic instructional practices. The more we take information and connect it to what students already know, whether that's in their home language or in other aspects of their lives or in other aspects of the new language, we have to make sure we're consistently capitalizing on that. That could include things like cognates. Cognates are words that sound the same or have the same kind of root in both languages. So an example of that could be the word examine and then examinar in Spanish. And so you want to make sure that you capitalize on those opportunities as much as you can. I know sometimes it's difficult to know that other language, especially sometimes when you get different caricature languages as you go through. So don't feel like you have to go and learn all of Japanese, but do know that anytime you have the opportunity, you can make those connections and it will get more bang for your buck instructionally. And then finally, making sure you are aware of and address false cognates. I think in my experience, the students have been really great about pointing out some of these false cognates. Usually I can picture several of my students over the years who had like giggle fits over words that sounded like really bad words in other languages or things like that. So don't be afraid to address those things, but also know that there are false cognates, things that really could confuse students. So making sure that we're aware of that as you are teaching as well. All right, and so I'm going to turn it back over to Alana to discuss monitoring and then that professional collaboration as we go through.
And in the chat, if you have any of these things or any ideas that you can think about that you use or that you can add to it, something that you've learned, please, again, use the chat. We know we've been talking a lot, or you can unmute too, but we are going to talk about the last little part. We're going to do a case study together, but monitoring and professional collaboration, we're going to talk about that next. Niki's the slide, so. So talking about progress monitoring. So MLLs require more frequent progress monitoring. As a special education teacher, this was kind of where I lived because you had to make sure the students were making progress. And for MLLs, it's kind of the same. We have to make sure that they're making progress. We're using the right interventions. It may show a substantial increase as language skills improve. Once those students get that language, maybe that's all they need. They need to have like a little bit, they're gonna acquire that language. And the research does support that. Even if they go home and they speak in their home language at home, they're going to come back, they're going to acquire that language, and they're going to be able to do both, which is great, which is amazing. So as that improves, we have to progress monitor and say maybe they don't need as much help anymore because they're getting proficient and shown by maybe the WIDA or some different assessments. Make sure supports match current needs during each monitoring period. So if we're working on decoding, that needs to be the intervention that we're working on. We need to look for an intervention that focuses on decoding, not comprehension. So that's really important for all students, but really for MLLs, that would be we're focusing on the skill and adjust made on progress monitoring data. So having those team meetings or those data meetings around progress monitoring is really important. I think that that's one of the things that if I went back as a teacher, that's something that I probably could have worked on better, put that in our calendar. This is when we're going to meet. We're going to meet on these 5 students, and we're going to do it more frequently so that students can move up and down in instructional groups. And I think schools do that really well. They do that really well now, but I think I could have improved on that one. Scaffold supports based on data. So for example, if students are doing an extended response and every time you're giving them those sentence stems so that they can fill out those extended response forms or like a question, if they have like a big blank. And at first you're going to give them those sentence stems stems or a word bank, and then you're going to look at the data and they're getting 100%. They're getting 10 out of 10. They're doing a great job with those sentence stems. Can we push that back? Can we take those sentence stems away? Can we take those word banks away? And then we're going to look at the data. Are they able to complete that without that? Because they could be when they're making progress. So don't always give them all those supports and just keep taking data on that. And then we're like, okay, they're getting 100%. So we're going to try to make it a little harder. We're going to increase that rigor. So we increase, decrease, so we're going to change the tactic if it doesn't work. If a sentence stem doesn't work, maybe we're going to try a storyboard, or maybe we're going to try a word bank. So we're going to decide what the student needs, because as they learn something, they might not need those supports anymore. And we're going to see if they can catch up without it and do more independent work. We're always try to strive for that independent part. Monitor impact of instructional practices. So again, if some of the students, especially our students with MLLs, I've seen a lot of times in classrooms where they have a card, a red card and a green card, instead of always having that verbal talk. If they understand an assignment, maybe they put it on the green side. And if they don't, they put it on the red, and then you come over and you can help them if they need it. Because some tasks they're able to do on their own, students are able to do on their own, and some they might need a little bit more support. And instead of always raising their hand or kind of, I taught in middle school. So it was a little bit more, I don't need any help, right? So, but if they had something a little bit more, and give it to all students, but the students will be able to ask questions this way. It just takes out the verbal, takes out them having to ask you. And it's a little bit more of just a strategy to use with students. Some students might need a visual. They like those instructions next to them. They like what happens first, second, and third. And they might even need a visual with that word. And then they might need to fade it away. Maybe they don't need the visual anymore. So just progress monitoring on that. What supports are you using? What are working? How can you scaffold that? How can you decrease that scaffold if they need it? So that's just some things to think about as you're looking at your own practice. And then the last one that we're going to talk about before the case study is collaborative support. So building the team. Making sure that you include gen ed, we're including Niki in there, me, the speech language, the SLP, because if they have a disability in their native language, when they acquire English, they're going to still probably have that speech, they're going to need some speech services in whichever language that they learn. EL, staff, parents, administrators, counselors to meet a variety of needs. We know students need that team approach. It shouldn't just be on the shoulders of the special education teacher or the EL teacher or the department. It really should be everybody. Communicate effectively and identify how data will be shared among the team, how often and who is responsible. Oftentimes we go to schools and they say, we have tons of data. And then we're like, but we don't know how to use it, or we don't know how to access it, or what does it mean? So really having that, what does it mean when the student reaches this? Or this is where we're going to think that the student needs to go. We want to see this growth. We're going to check that data every 2 weeks. And if they haven't reached it, what interventions are we going to put in place? Who's responsible for that? Niki talked about this, but capitalizing on the home language. We know that the research supports that students are able to speak in their home language and still acquire that new language. So that's really great. When you're teaching vocabulary, how do you say this in your language? And you can say it. How do we say it in English? Like Niki said, what's the same, what's different? It helps them. It helps them with memory. It helps them with all of those things, and it helps them keep their culture at home. And so that's all good things. Parent support in home language, like I talked about, that liaison that helps with that is very helpful. Welcoming our students and our parents to our school. Cognate, Niki talked about this. What's the same, different between the home language and the language that you know? And ensure alignment, streamline the strategies and use common vocabulary. If students are going out in, let's say, an RTI group, or they're leaving your classroom, and you don't have to deliver tier 2 instruction anywhere else, but if you do, say some schools have a win time, what I need time, and students go maybe to different classrooms. If we're working on a comprehension strategy, everybody should name it the same name. We have to use common vocabulary so students don't get confused. So if I'm using a specific strategy for problem solving, then the RTI person or the student, the EL teacher, we all need to be on the same page to know how we're teaching that student a certain skill. Because if they hear it from me and they hear it from Niki and they hear it from the EL teacher, that is really helpful. We shouldn't all be doing something different. We should all be on the same page. And I think that sometimes that doesn't always happen, but I think it's good when we have that team approach and we're working together. That is that's using common vocabulary is really key for those kids.
Sorry, I know I keep, every time I mute and unmute myself, I get that weird black box on your slides. I apologize. Up in the top right there. But we do want to switch over and just do a case study for a little bit. We want to spend some time. We're hoping this brings up maybe some things that you'll want to chat with us about, or that you'll talk about some things that have occurred in your district, or that this Lily might sound like someone you know, and we can talk about some of those roadblocks and things. So we want you to meet Lily. Lily is a 9-year-old student in the 4th grade. She was born in Mexico and moved to the United States 2 years ago with her family. Although Lily is enrolled in the school's English language learner program, she has shown ongoing challenges with both her language acquisition and academic progress. Her teachers have noted difficulties in comprehending and producing both written and spoken English, especially in more complex academic contexts. Lily's parents speak Spanish at home and have limited English proficiency. They are very supportive of her education, but often struggle to help her with schoolwork due to their own language barrier. Lily's family has been involved in the school's parent engagement programs, but they've expressed concern about Lily's academic difficulties. So we want to give you a minute to think about Lily. If she were your student, you can write this in the chat if you want, or even if you just want to kind of jot it down on a sticky note. What is your next step if Lily's in your class? She is your student. What's your next step that you're going to take with her? What other data would you like? So if you're going to ask for more testing or more information from other members of your team in your school, or even from her parents, what other data would you request or gather to help determine her needs? And which educational professionals should be included in the conversation about how to meet her needs? So if you take just a moment and jot this down, I'm going to go back to the case study that describes Lily. So again, you're looking for what's your next step, what other data do you need, and which educational professional should be included in this conversation. I'll give you a minute to start there. Great question, Laura. That's one of the things that's a great question to ask. Is she also fluent in Spanish? You know, can she read and write in Spanish? Are those skills there? Great question. Thank you for putting that in the chat. That also sort of answers that third question of who else do we need to involve in this conversation? And definitely Lily's parents, right? And other EL professionals within the building have to be involved so that we can learn a little bit more about her Spanish proficiency. Great. Good. I'm sorry, I just keep scrolling. It's hard to see when I have the slides up. Sorry. Is she in an intervention group? How does she compare to other language learners who are at a similar WIDA level with progress? Good. These are great questions to ask. So we're using the information we have, and then we're asking more diagnostic questions to try to figure out what we know about Lily and how else we can support her. So the professionals who worked with Lily asked some of those same questions. Great one. Thank you, Maggie. Did Lily have any interrupted educational experiences before her move? Great. Was she on grade level, say, in a school in Mexico? Great question.
And Laura also has, are we supporting her language level across all settings with Fidelity Tier 1 as well as her intervention group, assuming she's in one? So yeah, what does that Tier 1 instruction look like? Does she have intervention? Yes, perfect. Those are all great questions.
These are all questions we want to ask. Kudos to you, right? Pat yourselves on the back, because these are the questions that great practitioners are asking as they're working with students. The team working with Lily got a few more pieces of information about just her language proficiency and her other performance across academic contexts. Her language proficiency score on the WIDA Access was beginning. Her language acquisition, some information about her language acquisition is that she struggles to understand basic classroom instructions in English. Her English vocabulary is limited, and she relies on gestures or Spanish to communicate. And she has difficulty with multi-step directions in both English and Spanish. So that's the answer to some of that question you asked earlier. Some things about her academic performance. Overall is performing below grade level. She struggles to understand and retell stories, even with read aloud support. So when the text is read aloud to her, she struggles to understand and retell it. Difficulty organizing thoughts and generating ideas when writing. Her writing lacks detail and clarity, and she's unable to consistently use proper writing conventions. And then finally, frequent errors in basic math operations and a lack of fluency in general mathematical concepts. So we're seeing this across multiple subject areas and some issues in both languages with those multi-step directions, and then the text even with the read aloud support. Some things to know about her behavior as part of this present level data is that she's shy, she's often withdrawn in class and doesn't participate in group activities. So she's not interacting with her peers in those group activities. That's an important point. Shows signs of frustration when asked to perform tasks in English, and she has difficulty interacting with peers, potentially due to her language and academic challenges. Some things about her executive function. Remember, executive function is how students go about attacking tasks and completing them. And so sometimes she becomes overwhelmed by classroom tasks. She struggles to organize materials, to follow multi-step directions, and she has limited memory compared to other students, so that working memory piece. And she does have difficulty staying on task. So we've got a better picture now of Lily that we've added some additional data. And from there, let's just take a few moments and chat about it again. So now, knowing what you know, what's your next step if Lily is your student? What supports would you use to benefit her in your setting? So maybe it includes some testing or gathering some more information, but what supports do you think would benefit Lily where she's at right now in your classroom setting? But I love it. Laura, you kind of answered that one in both sections, right? Is that we really have to look at that tier 1 instruction and make sure that it's meeting her needs and being implemented with fidelity across the board. I'm gonna keep giving you, I'm hoping some of you are still typing out some ideas, but don't be shy about unmuting. And also I'm gonna give you an idea from my classroom. I always found with my language learners that something that I always would try, especially when they seem withdrawn in groups, was to make their group size just a little smaller. If I had a group of 4 working on a project, I would try to have a very focused group of 2. When I had an English language learner who's more withdrawn like that, and then really support and scaffold that group with lots of sentence stems, with supported maybe even like a mini anchor chart and infographic that went through the steps that had lots of visual support with it. Those were some things that I did in my classroom.
I did the same thing. You make the groups based on a talker and a non-talker. I would say someone that was more quiet, and then someone that would talk, and kind of some students would talk to each other more than they talk to adults. Yes. And there's some things in the chat as well. Laura said if she's not an MTSS, I'd want to talk about that with the team. Definitely. She needs to have some interventions. When is she? Because like we noted and Nikki said, she probably will do better in a smaller group. So the smaller the group, the better. And maybe if she is in a group with students that are having a hard time too, she might open up. And that's great. And then Maggie said the 5-turn conversations might be helpful for Lily too. Absolutely. I think those are both great ideas.
So this next step, the team working with Lily made the decision to go ahead and move forward with some testing because there were difficulties noted in both languages, and especially with some of that, not especially, but also with some executive functioning and following multi-step directions throughout. So when it came to formal assessment, this is the assessment data that you see for Lily. The school psychologist completed the developmental profile 4. This is a test that can be given in Spanish. It is validated in Spanish. There's English and Spanish versions available. So she was able to be tested in her home language on that part. It did indicate below average cognitive functioning, particularly in verbal comprehension and working memory. The observation by the school psychologist noted significant difficulty with processing verbal instructions, even with the use of visual aids. So even when those scaffolds and supports were in place, the student was still struggling with those with verbal directions. Behavior checklists indicated tendency towards inattention, distractibility, and difficulty initiating tasks. And again, those are things that were happening. Those behavior checklists go home to the parents as well. So making sure we understood that the tendency toward inattention and distractibility was happening in the home setting and the school setting, and in across both languages. Academic testing indicated substantial deficits in reading comprehension, math, reasoning, and written expression. And for speech and language, there were needs for receptive and expressive language abilities. They were significantly delayed for her age in both languages, though more so in English. So this circles back just a little bit to the question that I think it was Brianne asked earlier. The speech, in this case, the speech and language therapist, the SLP, and the school psych decided that both languages were important to kind of, again, English and Spanish share a lot of similar phonemes. So making sure that that was probably part of that decision because there were some similarities there. And then finally, syntax and grammar difficulties were not solely attributable to the lack of English language exposure. So it wasn't just that, it was a new language. There were things that were happening across the board that the student was struggling with. So additional information there. And so then the next question that we'd like to spend some time brainstorming with you. Now what we know, we said at the very beginning, one of the big pieces was that we really want to target the skill and the need and not just the label. So when we look at a full multifaceted approach to helping Lily, we looked at all the data, what accommodations, what services could best support Lily. And these can be in several different realms here. You'll see on the screen. I want you to think about all three. Can there be some things, English language development that ELD supports? So what kinds of things could be built into her ILP, or even just providing language support such as that Strive for 5 conversation framework? ELD supports are one option. Special education supports are possible as well. So those of you who have that special education lens, don't be afraid to share some ideas here. These are the kinds of supports. We know she needs support in all three of these areas. Wellness supports. Is it appropriate to pull in counseling services, those sorts of things to help support Lily? So I'll give you just a moment to start kind of brainstorming some of these ideas, and then we'll talk about some as well. I'll give you a minute to think.
Laura asked if you can go back the slide previously with the results.
Yep, no problem. Thanks for letting me know, Laura.
I think this exercise proves why you kind of need a team sometimes to think about things. You have everybody's thoughts. What kind of intervention and resources do we have at the school? This is our student. These are our results. What do we think that could be helpful in these categories? So hopefully this framework is helpful for you to go back and think about that through those lenses, because I think this is helpful if not just you doing it on your own, but really having that team approach to figure that one out.
I'm going to click forward to go through some of the supports. I know you all are thinking. Laura, thank you for sharing. She said difficulty with verbal, and so adding lots of those supports there, making it visual, providing visual supports, but intentional teaching. So making sure we're teaching how to use those visuals and how to teach those supports, especially with that supporting that working memory deficit. Good job connecting those two. maybe an intervention working on verbal comprehension in special education, perhaps with that SLP support from speech and language. Great. I love, yeah, Laura has so many good ideas. Thank you, Laura, for sharing out all of your great ideas and all the great things that are happening in your district as well. Thank you.
Everybody's going to have Laura come to their school.
It's funny because I'm just parroting the things that I have heard our EL director say.
Oh,
So
perfect.
he gets all the credit.
No, you do.
That's wonderful. That sounds like a really excellent supportive resource. So I love that for you, Laura, that it's a place where you're able to get those resources, but then also think about how to apply them. And to be able to apply them to a case study like this is a big deal. So thank you. Direct explicit instruction. I love that, especially in that vocabulary piece, bringing in the vocabulary in context across academic context and just conversational support. Yeah. Predictable routines are excellent. So you see here, I switched to a slide that has some ideas that we were thinking of and that we are supported by the research as well. And lots of things that can be done here. It's important to know that special education supports, if you do go the route of special education services, that would need to be done through an IEP. So we're not just going to implement these things without the proper paperwork, although some of them are things that we can do as part of Tier 1 support or through MTSS. But again, making sure you have the proper paperwork for any of these supports that you implement. But things like scaffolded instruction, visual aids that Laura brought up, interactive instruction as much as possible, where we're offering those opportunities to respond so that students have the opportunity to practice the language in context. So giving Lily as many opportunities to speak as possible is wonderful. Extra supported practice. So again, not just extra tons and tons of worksheets, but how can we provide really supported practice for Lily in, say, the area of vocabulary? So could we offer the opportunity to have additional labels on things, to allow her to label things, to provide vocabulary support that shows connections between English and Spanish, which is her home language, those sorts of things. And then building that small group support, putting as many opportunities for her to be in a small group as possible are so key. So those things would support her English language needs. You'll notice many of those things in the next column as well. Targeted intervention, small group supports, speech and language services, all of these things are also going to support her. And those are considered special education supports as well. Offering accommodations through her IEP, and perhaps even considering additional testing to get more data that you may need to know about Lily. And then to really look at this holistically, we also have to consider she is overwhelmed in the academic setting, and she does tend to be withdrawn. So looking for those small group opportunities, providing counseling support, and maybe even social skills support to help her engage in a positive way with her peers and adults who are there to help her as well. And to address some of the pieces that Alana went through earlier, how would you monitor the impact of these supports? So I know there's so much on the screen there, but maybe in your mind, think of just one of them. If I'm going to, say offer visual aids in the literature block or the reading block for this student, I'm going to offer a certain number of visual aids and test that over a few weeks to see if it helps the student to engage better with maybe the stations that are happening during the reading block, or even with the text itself that's being introduced during the reading block. So how would you monitor the impact of these, and how do you ensure that they're being offered with fidelity, which is something Laura brought up earlier? Are we really using these things with fidelity in that Tier 1 and throughout the entire instructional cycle? Thank you all for your participation. Some things we want you to consider in this last little piece as we wrap up is, how is this similar or different from the encounters in your current setting? So is this something that sounds pretty real to you? You've met a student like Lily. Maybe you're picturing your own version of Lily as we were talking through this. And if so, what real world roadblocks do you face in this process? What are some struggles? Maybe a case study on a screen seemed a little easier than what you're facing in real life, and we want to hear about that. So if you'd like, please take a few moments and share what are some of these challenges. What supports do you need in your setting, or what ideas do you need help brainstorming with to make your setting more successful for students and for you currently? Are there other things we could help you with?
Yep. Or maybe you have these processes already in your school, and you listen to this and you're like, oh, we do really good with this, but maybe we need to work on something else. You can bring that back to your team, or there's just I feel like you can listen to it through any lens, or hopefully you got a strategy that you can do, or it just depends on what you do. Do you have a hard time with your team deciding when to refer? Do you guys have over referrals? You have under referrals? There's lots of things in this in this 90 minutes that we discussed. So if you have any connections, you can put that in the chat, whichever way you'd like to, if you want. Again, choice. Not making you.
And also don't forget that the TA Center offers these kind of services regularly. So don't be shy about reaching out to Alana or myself. We have a team that includes a school site, that includes lots of professionals in the field, where we can get some of these real world options to help you work through these. We could zoom in just specifically with your district and provide some of those supports as well. So please don't be shy about using the TA Center in general. Laura, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, so I'm the district special education specialist, and Danielle, who's on here too, who's driving carpool, and that's why she's so quiet. She is our district EL director. And so I feel like we have a pretty good process to make sure that we're not overqualifying students. But we have it feels like we have an increase in students that are dual qualified. So they're getting, in theory, lots of good support, but then stay at like a level 2 in WIDA for years. And I'm looking for that magic wand, or like, is there a prescribed intervention, or is it, just keep practicing, because it feels like the language deficit is a both, like the kid isn't fluent in either language.
Absolutely. And I think that that's very common in the research and in my personal practice. It's very common for our dual labels to have that struggle across the board. I know that when I read through the research now, I picture my former students, but the biggest thing that just keeps coming across, it suggests in the research to document those conversations that you're having with students. Are you using the reflective language of taking what they're saying and repeating it back with appropriate grammar and syntax? And so just documenting that, because again, we think we talk to students a lot, and this is not judgy at all. I'm picturing my own practice. Sometimes I think, oh, I'm definitely having conversations with these students regularly, every day. We're talking about these things. I'm intentionally speaking with these students so that they hear that oral language piece. And what I know when I actually look at the research is that we're not having that in that reflective way, where we are engaging the student in conversation in a meaningful way. So that could be a piece of data to collect on. It might be great. I know in Alana, the school that Alana taught at, they would regularly go in and observe each other teaching just to look for certain goals. This might be a great opportunity to take a look at what the classroom experience looks like for one of your dual label students for maybe 1 hour, and see how many of those in-depth Strive for 5 conversations are happening. And if we can increase that number over, say, a month, and then see if that shows some growth with that. That sounds reasonable?
That one actually feels really manageable.
Well, that makes me happy. And definitely, it seems like a small fix. And it really is kind of a small lift. And then with any luck, what the research says is that you're going to see just an explosion of growth when it's really reflected in what they're saying and then interactively with an adult.
Thank you.
Well, it's 4:30 or 3:30 or 5:30, whatever time it is over there. It's 4:30 for me, probably 5:30 for you guys. So that is the whole 90 minutes. But So we don't want to go over your time, but if you have questions, we will stay on after, of course, and do that, right, Nick? So we can just make
Yeah,
sure.
please do. Please just know that we are here to support you. And I'm going to skip that wrap up slide just to honor your time as best as possible. But we would love if you would also take just a moment to fill out the evaluation there on the left side of your screen, or go to iepta.org/eval and fill out the evaluation. Let us know what worked about today. This is new content for us. So this is the first time this content has been presented in this way. So if you have suggestions for how to make it better or to celebrate what worked, we would appreciate that information as well. Don't be shy about reaching out to us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is our first time doing this one, but lots of great information. Yeah, a lot of information in 90 minutes, but we did it. We did it. So thank you guys for coming on. We appreciate it. Yeah, let me look at the chat. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Laura. Lori and Laura. And you will get your PGP points after you'll get the certificate. They already left, I think, a couple people, but